Now we take a look at the march of populism at the turn of the century. We'll see the opposition to the Bourbons, disenfranchising Louisiana, resisting the Bourbons, and then enter the old regulars, the rise of good government, the Great Exposition, Louisiana and the First World War, Governor John M. Parker, and then one of the great watershed moments in Louisiana, the discovery of oil. Opposition to the Bourbons came mostly from the populist movement. The Bourbons countered by labeling the populists as communists, and that would be a long-standing tradition for the next 60 to 70 years and maybe even longer. The problem with populism, though, is that it was difficult as a political movement in an undemocratic state like Louisiana that followed very arcane voting rules. But the populists did gain power among free-voting blacks and small farmer whites. But it was very difficult to win offices in Louisiana because the Bourbons controlled the votes. Thus, in the election of 1896, John N. Farr, a populist, took on Murphy J. Foster for another term in office. The voters in the state, if you had done a fair election, supported Farr. But the election was completely fraudulent and Foster won. Majority African American parishes voted overwhelmingly Democratic. That tells you right there the voting was rigged. And Foster, though, peacefully took over again as governor, and the legislature then elected Samuel McHenry to the Senate. With Plessy v. Ferguson now on the books, Louisiana began to disenfranchise the African Americans and other minorities. Disenfranchisement is the revocation of or failure to grant suffrage, that is, the right to vote, to a person or a group of people. What had happened in 1896 was a wake-up call to the Bourbons that skullduggery and bulldozing at the polls would no longer work. The populists had caused the people to rise up. So at first, the legislature gave what was called a blank check amendment for the voting rules to be switched any way that they wanted. And instead, what happened was they called the Constitution of 1898, which copied the 1879 Constitution but imposed suffrage restrictions. It put on a literacy test, which many African Americans unfortunately failed, proof of property exceeding $300, a $1 poll tax, and showing back receipts for property that you may have owned in the past, which means that that was an ex post facto law, which is considered to be highly unconstitutional today. And as a result of this, black suffrage declined dramatically. One other thing that came out of the Constitution of 1898 was a law saying that juries did not have to be unanimous for criminal conviction in certain trials. This law is still on the books today. And Senator J.P. Morrell of the Louisiana legislature is attempting to get that overturned via constitutional amendment. The biggest results of Plessy v. Ferguson were the Jim Crow laws. This is the legal imposition of segregation. What became segregated? Streetcars, prostitution, whorehouses were segregated. Black and white cohabitation was prohibited. Sale of alcoholic beverages to blacks when whites were present was prohibited. No Indian-black cohabitation. Theaters, shows, circuses were all segregated. Jails were segregating, and let us not forget, segregated housing. There you see, spelled out before you, an example of a Jim Crow law. Any person who shall rent any part of any such building to a Negro person or a Negro family when such building is already in whole or in part in occupancy by a white person or white family or vice versa when the building is in occupancy by a Negro person or Negro family shall be guilty of a misdemeanor and on conviction thereof shall be punished by a fine of not less than $25, no more than $100, or be in prison not less than 10 or more than 60 days, or both such fine and imprisonment in the discretion of the court. And that tells you just how sophisticated these laws were becoming. Resistance to the Bourbons came mostly from populists like W. Hurd, who was governor of Louisiana from 1900 to 1904. He undertook major prison reform, and it was during his term that oil was discovered in Louisiana. Very few understood just how important this would be for the state. Hurd was succeeded by Newton C. Blanchard, who was governor from 1904 to 1908. Blanchard, a former U.S. congressman and U.S. senator, was somewhat on the progressive side and upheld the humanity and citizenship of blacks. That is, he was still a white supremacist, but he believed that African Americans did possess some political rights. He excoriated lynching and introduced the party primary, which was a great program of the populists and later of the progressive movement. He built schools and facilities for African Americans and improved public education throughout all of Louisiana. One of the more progressive forces that entered Louisiana politics at the turn of the century was a group that called themselves the Old Regulars. Progressives were in some ways an offshoot of the populist movement, but they were not of the populists themselves. They looked for better systems of government, more democracy. They wanted to see government doing work for the people, doing what it was supposed to do, better health systems, public health initiatives, better schools, and so forth. And the Old Regulars bought into this progressive movement. The Old Regulars were a political machine that centered in what was known as the Choctaw Club of New Orleans. Their official name was the Regular Democratic Organization, the RDO, and from this they got to be known as the Old Regulars. They allied with elite elements in the country to maintain New Orleans' place in the state. This oftentimes meant going against some of the Bourbon leadership. Their main goal was to defend New Orleans from state interference, and their main leader was Martin Bourbon. The son of Jewish-German immigrants, he was a charter member of the RDO and later became mayor of New Orleans. Bourbon undertakes many initiatives to improve the city. He established the New Orleans Public Belt Railroad, which put a railroad along the port facilities of New Orleans to move cargo more easily, which made New Orleans better for business. He improved water and drainage in the New Orleans. In fact, he laid down the sewage system that the Civil War Union officers like Banks and others had helped design for the city. Unfortunately, we're still using that same water and drainage system. He also put in a commission council form of government. City councils were a hallmark of progressive government at the time. There you see Mayor Bourbon sitting at the Choctaw Club with some of the city's more noteworthy leaders of the time. In 1884, New Orleans hosted the World's Industrial and Cotton Centennial Exposition to commemorate 100 years since the ginning of cotton and also to celebrate sugar as well. Nearly 1/3 of all cotton produced in the United States was handled in New Orleans, and this was the reason for the site being chosen as the city. However, you could not get away from the fact that Edward Burke was still alive and well in Louisiana. He managed to steal $1.7 million of state money, including most of the fair's budget, and this delayed the opening by 2 weeks. But when it did open, it was a spectacular affair. 249 acres from St. Charles to the river, which now is Audubon Park. It could be entered directly either by railway from the St. Charles streetcar line, by steamboat, or even by ocean-going ship, which could come up the Mississippi River. The main building, larger than the Crystal Palace of the famous London Exposition of the 1850s, enclosed 33 acres, the largest roof structure constructed up to that time. The United States also gave the fair permission to build a monument to Robert E. Lee at Tivoli Circle, where St. Charles became Naiad Street, and on the pedestal they put a statue of Robert E. Lee and renamed it Lee Circle, in which they avowed that what they had done in seceding was essentially correct, and that despite the Union coming back together, Louisiana had come back to the grand old days of the past, with only the difference being slavery no longer existed, but segregation and white supremacy ruled supreme. That's what the Lee Circle Monument was really all about. The picture that you see on your right was the Statue of Peace, the genius of history. This was a decorative monument from the fair. It has since been removed and put onto Esplanade Avenue. You can see it where the Bayou Road intersection comes in. This was not the grand hall of the Cotton Exposition. This was the horticultural hall, which had many different plants from many different nations throughout the World's Fair. This was a section of the main hall just prior to it being opened up. Unfortunately, the main hall burned down, but there is one little remnant of it left. There is a small angular chunk of brick on the 9th hole of the Audubon Park golf course, and you can see it jutting out into the water. That's the only thing that they have left of it. It was tragically burned down. In the upper left is what's called the octagonal building. This was part of the Mexico exhibit at the 1884 World's Fair. On the right is part of the main hall, the Grand Hall of the World's Fair. The lower left is a piece of iron that was donated by the state of Alabama. Many people wrongly call this the meteorite. It may indeed be a meteorite, but it was a hunk of iron that the state of Alabama donated to the World's Fair as part of the state of Alabama Exposition. And it now sits out on the 18th hole of Audubon Park's golf course. And you can see the spire of Holy Name of Jesus Church behind it. That's looking towards St. Charles Avenue. And finally, the ground plan of the entire World's Fair. World's Fairs in New Orleans are troublesome. They are wonderful things. However, they have often been places for rampant fraud. 20 years after the World's Fair in New Orleans, the world went to war. The Great War of 1914-1918 is best treated in an entire course that Dr. Gunther Bischoff does, and even as part of the larger U.S. History 2 course. However, we only need to look at it in terms of the city of New Orleans and the state of Louisiana. With the coming of the war, there was a great disruption in the commodities market. The need for cotton and sugar and rice went up, but it was disrupted because the sea lanes were being interdicted by German submarines and so forth. Between 1915 and 1916, France, Britain, and unoccupied Belgium were calling for more and more of the U.S. commodities, which was a boon for the port of New Orleans and the state of Louisiana as a whole. In April 1917, the United States declared war on Germany, and because of a war, cotton tripled in price and sugar doubled, which meant great economics for the people of Louisiana. But like most Americans, Louisianans were reluctant for war. This was not a war that we went into at first with blaring trumpets and great jingoistic expressions. No, we reluctantly went into this war. And the importance of the port of New Orleans made Louisiana a key player in this. 3 new shipyards were built. A $2.5 million repair yard was built. And a massive warehousing terminal was also built, which later became the Nashville Avenue Wharf. Louisiana soldiers went to war, and Louisiana became known as a prime place to build bases and conduct maneuvers, because you will remember, during the Civil War, much of western Louisiana was burnt to a cinder and the ground was left open. This made it prime for many of the Army bases, which is why you have many Army bases throughout the South. Camp Beauregard, which is just north of Alexandria, swelled to include more than 1,300 buildings on 15 square miles. The Germans also took an interest in Louisiana as the mouth of the Mississippi River became the focus of U-boat attacks, and there were numerous ships sunk, and there were numerous battles off the coast of Louisiana. In the picture you see there, you see two troop carriers of World War I doing exercises in western Louisiana. It shows the patriotism. You see a World War I parade going down Canal Street in New Orleans. You see a World War I style biplane in a Louisiana airfield. And then after the war, memorials sprung up throughout the towns of Louisiana, memorializing the dead. Governor John M. Parker, who was governor between 1920 and 1924, was one of the lynch mob leaders in the great lynching of New Orleans in 1891. He was a friend of Theodore Roosevelt. He was a member of the progressive wing of the new Progressive Party that was coming on. And then he turned into a Democrat, and a very staunch Democrat. He served as a vice presidential candidate in 1916. He was a strong opponent of women's suffrage. He was president of the New Orleans Cotton Exchange and the Board of Trade. He was a competent man, but extremely arrogant and very aloof. He was an opponent of the Ku Klux Klan. He defeated Franklin P. Stubbs, the old Regulars candidate for governor, and he was a staunch opponent of the RDO and the city of New Orleans. Parker is well known for relocating LSU from downtown Baton Rouge to the current campus, and the big agricultural center, which also was the basketball arena at the south end of the campus, now bears his name to this day. In the very second year of or really the first year of the 20th century, oil was discovered in Louisiana. The first petrochemical plant in Louisiana was built in Jennings, just to the west of Lafayette in 1905. Also discovered were sulfur and natural gas, of which Louisiana is the largest producer in the nation. At first, they did not know what natural gas was, and they let 300,000 cubic feet of it escape before they had realized that they had hit something very, very important. Louisiana became second only to Texas in petroleum and mineral production. And so in 1920, under Parker's leadership, the modern petrochemical industry was born. And this brings an influx of northern, middle-class workers, prime recruits for another populist movement, but it also affects the demographic of Louisiana. It also brings down northern business interests into Louisiana, many of whom see Louisiana as a place to be exploited rather than as a place to be built up. Louisiana is seen as a great tub of oil and natural gas, rather than as a place that needed to be built up and developed even further. This is the famous U.S. Customs House down at the foot of Canal Street. Now part of it houses the Audubon Insectarium. The Customs House was the place where incoming ships paid their duties, and the officers collected those duties and so forth, sent them out to collect it from the ships. The Customs House also carried a variety of governmental functions, federal governmental functions, so it was a federal government institution. This is a photograph of Canal Street during the snow of 1895. A rare sight indeed. This photograph is looking up St. Charles Avenue from Canal Street. You see the figure of the statue of Henry Clay right in front of you. That statue was then moved into Lafayette Square Park in front of Gallier Hall. That is not Gallier Hall you're looking at. That is the old St. Charles Hotel, which was burned down. The St. Charles Hotel during the Civil War was the largest slave market in the United States. It has since been replaced by the Capital One building, the second tallest building in the city, the brown building next to the One Shell Square. And here in this photograph you see Rex, King of Carnival, riding through New Orleans somewhere around 1900, maybe even in the 1800s. If you notice that the streetcars are still being pulled by mules, and so it indicates that it may have been earlier. But this is Rex going up Canal Street.